Japan. A country and culture steeped in history, a careful equilibrium of nature and technology over the years. They managed to straddle that line almost perfectly, and throughout the 80s and 90s they were at the forefront of most of the technology we know and love. But this video isn't about the history of Japan. This is about one of the many creations they made during the 80s. The year is 1987, September 1987. Right now the most popular console and powerful gaming machines on the market are from Nintendo and Sega. In the land of the rising sun though, Nintendo's entertainment system is the clear market leader. Since its launch in 1983, it dominated Japan and later the North US. Sega's more powerful MK3 or Master System fared better in Europe, but aside being technically superior in almost all aspects, it lagged behind the Big N in market share outside of the European market. But a tiny white and red challenger was about to emerge that would disrupt the 8-bit status quo, and it came from nowhere. In a repeated trait, their biggest rival came from a previous potential partner. Hudson Soft had tried to sell its own HUD cards to Nintendo for games, Hue cards. It was rejected, but NEC found a partner in Hudson Soft as it wanted to enter the console space after seeing excellent growth from its PC hardware. A partnership was forged that endured until the tail end of the last century. Using NEC's brand in computers, the name was a given. The PC Engine was alive.
PC Engine 全開 NEC から
As I can never really know what many of you may or may not like, I'm trying something new with this video, an additional one that covers something I've done for years: repairs, mods, upgrades and restores. The very PC Engine I've used for this video and others was a salvage repair job I purchased and fixed back in March. Now you can check out my adventures of finding the faults, fun and restoration on that duo, and leave your feedback on it if you want more, you liked it, you didn't like it or whatever. But now, back to the show. Now, undressing this slightly larger Duo R shows a still compact and well put together motherboard that demonstrates the reliance on capacitors of the time. This is one area you get very accustomed to replacing via recapping in the retro world, as they are prone to bulge and electrolyte leakage as the years tick by. It's relatively simple on most machines, but it just needs a steady hand and solder skills to get it right, especially removing them. Now, the additional internal CD-ROM aside, it really is a PC Engine with larger RAM, additional storage cache for the CD-ROM, which came with the add-on for the standalone console. The core internals are almost identical to that original, which comprise of Hudson's own 6280 CPU, accompanied with PSG sound. Now, this CPU was competent and far more powerful than the Nintendo Entertainment System or Famicom, itself a derivative of the all-conquering 6502 that was the centre of the Atari VCS and the defining Commodore 64, among many more. It sports two SATs, which offer a NES matching 1.79 MHz and then a full-blown 7.1 MHz mode, which was the most common for this tiny gaming box. It is still the smallest console new ever launched, and this CPU was powerful, if limited cost at its centre. It was a mighty 8-bit CPU that stemmed from a time that was just edging into that 16-bit bandwidth and address space. Something which it had itself, a 16-bit bus due to the 16-bit GPU, but it was limited by the 8 kilobytes of system RAM, which was much lower than the competition of both the Genesis or the Megadive and the Super Nintendo yet to come. But it was better than the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System, and remember, when it launched, that was all it was competing against. Closely coupled and tucked alongside this, and being fed by that very same CPU, is the Hudson Soft 6270 and 6260. The 6270, the VDC, or the Video Display Controller, generates all your tile maps, your backgrounds, your sprites, your sprite tables, and it effectively generates all the images you see on screen and moves them around. It has hardware sprites, up to 64 of them, but limited again by 16 per line, and that's one of the reasons why you get a lot of flickering in PC Engine games. And they can be from a range of sizes, 16 by 16 up to 32 by 64 maximum. and it was pretty famous for its big chunky sprites. That's one of the reasons why it stood out, certainly over the Master System in games like Vendetta, which looked drastically different between two consoles, even though they are theoretically 8-bit. But that 16-bit GPU, this and the VCE do make up that difference. One of the biggest ones is that 64 kilobytes of RAM, 4 times the amount available in the Master System at 16 kilobytes, but they do even out with the same 8 kilobyte on the CPU, but the Master System is a slower one at around 4 megahertz. So it is a big leap over that 8-bit machine. It was really only a couple of years behind. It pushes all of its data from VRAM to the internal buffers ready for display on the scan line using DMA. It's not as swamped as the Megadrive was, but it certainly uses it, as does the CPU, which keeps the speed. This was a pretty fast machine. Some of the games on it are very impressive indeed. Now this is powered, or at least displayed, by the secondary unit here, the VCE, the Video Color Encoder, and it really does what it says on the tin. This generates the images on screen, the final output, and uses that 9-bit limited palette to generate the output on screen. This is still 3 bits per color channel, so this is why titles look very similar to the Megadrive, but I'll cover that more later in the video. And in many ways it stood up a lot to later console generations and really gave a battle to those 8 and 16-bit machines, certainly bettering them in some ways. Now the sound was still very limited. I know many people talk about the fact that it had loads of potential with its 5-bit up to 10-bit sampled sound, which we pushed through by the CPU, and because of the generally powerful graphics on the system, it could do quite a lot with its sound. It didn't use samples that often and really stuck to the white noise and wavetables that were prevalent in the era, and pretty much sounds like any other chip of the time, such as the almighty SID chip of the Commodore 64. And in many titles it can sound very similar to the Master System and the Megadrive, albeit occasionally cleaner samples and cleaner PCM audio than the Megadrive generally had, but I wouldn't say it was a better sounding system than the Megadrive. Although this challenged the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom to begin with, and it won quickly by dominating the Japanese market and outselling that machine and becoming the new #1 seller in less than a year, its real battle and success came from fighting with the as yet to be released 16-bit machines of the Megadrive / Genesis and the Super Nintendo. An amazing feat in timescales alone, but even greater when you realise it was at heart an 8-bit machine with a 16-bit display chip, just like the Master System. Now it was powered by Hudson's own 8-bit 6280, as I've already covered, and this is a derivative of the 6502 that was at the centre of the Atari VCS and that defining Commodore 64, among many more. Its 2 states gave it the options and scalability to push beyond any 8-bit machine, predominantly at the time, and it's still one of the smallest consoles new ever launched. And this CPU was powerful, if limited somewhat by its 8KB space. It was a mighty 8-bit CPU that stemmed from a time that was just edging into that 16-bit bandwidth and address space. This was all within 10 years of the current video game industry really kicking off. That very same 1977 Atari VCS you see in front of you was still a current machine. Even if it was old technology, it was still relevant. The booming 8-bit computer market was at the sharp edge of game advancement, but the PC Engine was another leap forward, closer to the as then top-end arcade hardware. Even with the likes of the sublime and legendary Last Ninja on the mighty C64, this machine and game was starting to look dated compared to this new tech monster. The CPU was right on the cusp of 8-bit technology, and that 16-bit Motorola 68000 intrinsically linked, but that's a story for another video. And it was growing into the ubiquitous processor for the next generation, at the heart of the emerging 16-bit computer war, which I've already covered in depth with my Amiga vs Atari ST videos. You can check them out if you want to get some delve into some computer history. Now the 8-bit CPU did have some limits, but it's not really as bad as is widely thought, and it certainly is compensated for by its impressive 16-bit graphics chip. And this was really the start of showing how important graphics functions would become. Obviously the Amiga beat it by a couple of years. It is also the cause for the US TurboGrafx 16 rebrand. It could muster a Mega Drive matching 512 colours from that very same identical 9-bit palette, yet it excelled beyond that with a near max 481 on-screen limit. It not only bested that yet to be released Mega Drive, but it also did a fair job of keeping up with the Super Nintendo. Now, imagine that level of leapfrog now. Admittedly, it often ran games in a 256 colour limit, split between the backgrounds 240 across all the hardware sprites and then a further 241 for the background layer. The same 9-bit palette means games often look close to the Mega Drive, even though in theory they are wider in colour use. You see, at low colour levels, palette range can be far more important than on-screen colours, with the Amiga and Super Nintendo highlighting this often, such as the Mega Drive ports of Shadow of the Beast, which again is worse still on the PC Engine CD version here, still with that amazing David Whittaker soundtrack though. The single biggest weakness the PC Engine had over the Super Nintendo and certainly the Mega Drive was its background layers, arguably the sprites. You see, the background layers, it only has one, and it splits those up similar to how the Mega Drive does, and it all is created the same as I covered before in my Amiga video as planar graphics, although they are interleaved here and they're not stacked on top like a standard contiguous block. And that's a 4-bit colour cycle for the background and exactly the same for the sprites. That's why you effectively have a split colour scheme of 256 colours, the palette range for backgrounds, and 256 colour palette range for the sprites. Now remember, the limit here is 16 per tile on the background, so you can change it per tile for the palettes you've got, but overall you're limited to a maximum within that range. Now the argument here is the Mega Drive could handle more layers, i.e. a background layer, a sprite layer, and then it had its dependencies between what was priority and what was lower priority, and that's why a lot of effects in the Mega Drive had sprites passing in front of and behind screens. Lots of games use this quite often throughout the cycle to flip objects back and forth between the background. On the PC Engine it only had one, and that's why you see a lot of titles here such as Vendetta or Vigilante, where the characters themselves actually float on the background. If you look at the feet of the character, the tyres, they're actually over the tyres, not behind, and when they get knocked off they fall in front of the tyres, not behind the tyres, and even the Master System had this option at the back. But there was ways around this, and most of those were using the line scroll techniques, or the raster lines, which I've covered before in previous videos, by using those to scroll independently at different speeds and move the image, which gives that effect of depth and parallax scrolling. Street Fighter 2 on the PC Engine uses this, and that's how the floor effect is created by using these line scrolling tricks. In addition to this, you can also use sprites to actually emulate an additional background layer, and again using those two splits of priority, many games has that to give you the depth of a background scrolling at different speeds as the front. Again though, these were many tricks, and many games and developers didn't really use them, and you had to try harder to get there. Combined and pushed all out, it couldn't do it as well as the Mega Drive, and when it came to sprites, it was limited to 64, even if it improved the resolution, whereas the Mega Drive could go higher and push to 80 sprites. The PC Engine was limited at 64 and 16 per line, and this is why you see lots of breakup and flickering, because when the buffer RAM runs out, anything beyond that limit of 16 just simply doesn't get drawn, and that's why you have partial breakup of sprites that actually destroy the image quality on the PC Engine. It happens on the Mega Drive as well. It's quite common with hardware sprites of this type because that's a limitation of the memory and the amount it can draw at the same time. Now, one thing to recall is lots of people talk about sprites. Sprites can be tiled like a background, and that means that they're tiled together in a sprite table, and then you end up with having multiple 16x16 or 16x32 or whatever size you might have to make up your images. So China Warrior here is a good example. When the game launched, they blocked all these together, and the one Bruce Lee character in the main title is actually made up of multiple sprites over that screen. That's why they're so huge. A sprite isn't one single image. A sprite is a fixed block of pixels, normally constrained by 8x8, but the Mega Drive could go that small. The PC Engine could only go as small as 16x16, and you then tile those together to make bigger sprites. And that was one of the PC Engine's big standouts at the time. It was a great sprite pushing monster. But beyond this, the PC Engine was such a prominent force in Japan due to its planning. Right from inception, CD-ROM was a known entity, having it factored into the way the console's designed via the interface at the rear using the SCSI protocols. Now this was the first dedicated CD-ROM consumer device and by far the first dedicated to gaming. Less than 18 months after its 1987 launch, it had a CD-ROM add-on ready for widespread consumer purchase, just as the Sega Mega Drive itself launched in fact. NEC and Hudson were ahead of the game by a good chalk. Now this expanded media was partially born from necessity. The Hue cards were compact, cheap, but also limited in space, with 20 megabits or 2.5 megabytes being the largest. The Master System game cards were affected even more though, but they could rely on bigger 4 megabit ROM cartridges by default, and almost exclusively, something the PC Engine lacked, and as such needed new hardware to push beyond those limits. Now, due to the hardware construction, it could not really support FMV like the Mega Drive and Mega CD, but unlike that combo, the CD-ROM add-on does not have any extra hardware to enhance the base console, aside CD streaming audio from Redbook data. You can check out more CD action in my previous 2 Sega Mega CD videos where I discuss the hardware construction, the tricks, and the games that the mass market Sega add-on delivered. Now, by contrast, the PC Engine CD-ROM was little more than a vastly expanded media format with improved soundtracks. The add-on unit itself, or the combined duo, or others seen here, have no extra chips to augment and then interleave workloads like the Mega CD. Now this is due to it being hooked into the ROM bus and feeding the main blocks of RAM and VRAM via the single speed laser. In all intents, it's a huge Hue card and little more. The extension port on the PC Engine fully exposes the entire ROM, RAM, the ROM bus, including the video output, even audio. This enables a great many retro mods, such as RGB output, using the same path the CD-ROM itself hooks into. As most early CD devices of the time show, loading times and seeking can creep in, which cartridges almost never suffer from. Suprising is arguably the very best arcade port of the time, and it regularly demonstrates these hangs of data seek and streaming data into RAM. It also shows that most games were really identical to the Hue cards, just with long animated intros or sequences added, and obviously with speech and music. During gameplay, the soundtracks are enhanced with the CD, largely free-to-play CD music, as the level data is already packed into RAM. Many games only use the CD to load the game and then sit idle until the next loading sector is triggered. The early units only had 64 kilobytes of cache to stream from disk and use, and the later Super System cards, or the Duo units, boosted this fourfold to 256 kilobytes, which helps reduce the seek and store moments, but does not eradicate them entirely. The proud pioneer in CD gaming was the original Street Fighter, which bears little resemblance to the far more recognised sequel. Renamed as Fighting Streets, this was an incredibly impressive arcade port from the time, which offered a close graphical match but with extra CD sound. The speech still comes from the CPU, or the sound chip, with its impressive 5-bit PCM sample rates across all 6 channels, being hard to understand due to poor effort here and non-native speaker than any direct hardware fault. In fact, the PC Engine was a very capable sound machine of the time, with a variety of modulation FM tile sounds and even 10-bit samples possible. It was really light years ahead of any other 8-bit gaming machine of the time, and it was the first true arcade in your home. In fact, some arcades were based on the particular CPU machine. Hue cards could still deliver the goods though, with the almighty Street Fighter sequel being a truly magnificent port onto the little credit card ROMs that was better than the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive at times. It sounded brilliant, if not up to the standards of the 16-bit competition fully. Graphically though, this was the real deal. 256 colours, parallax scrolling floors, huge well-animated sprites, vast animation frames, smooth 60Hz refresh rates, and as many colours as the Super Nintendo version. It was glorious. The biggest issue was at the time only a very small portion of Western gamers even knew the console existed. Now I'm talking actual low numbers into the tens of thousands, as the fierce competition and impact the PC Engine made in Japan thrust both Sega and Nintendo to take it very seriously, and it beat it to Western markets, paired with the multi-million-pound advertising campaign put paid to any real battle before it actually began. Now in the UK, much of the buzz around the Skips-sized console came from the king of gaming mags of the time, CVG, or Computer and Video Games to the uninitiated. The Eastern-focused import section ran a segment on the PC Engine, and specifically R-Type, which was currently wowing arcade goers. You see, in the UK, shoot-em-ups were the modern-day equivalent of first-person shooters. They reigned supreme above all else, and is why so many of them had only European or UK releases, as the US was not quite as enamoured with them as us Brits were. I lived on arcade shoot-em-ups at the time. Now, the PC Engine delivered an almost pixel-perfect port for a few-month-old, state-of-the-art, massively successful TATO Arcade. Being an early launch though, the HuCard limits presented themselves, with the game being split across 2 releases, covering all the levels from the arcade. Now, it was truly amazing, and after reading that infamous article that annoyed even NEC themselves, as the lust for an official release prompted small independents to start importing them. My local telegame store was one such company that saw a market in this, and with the PC Engine being almost single-handedly responsible for the grey import scene emerging. Much like the concurrent Japanese motorcycle 250 and 400 mini sports bikes of the time, this was the exclusive chance to own something that simply was not available anywhere else but the land of the rising sun. Now, I remember vividly going into telegames and seeing R-Type running on the CRT on the desk, pad gripped tightly by the owner. My mouth dropped open, my eyes wide and filled with lust. What black magic was this?
She will be mine. Oh yes, she will be mine.
Sadly not, as the cost was just too high for my shallow pockets of the time. Now, I did try to find the money, and I worked very hard, extra jobs, side jobs, everything else I could do. But by the time 1989 rolled around, the Megadive was in the same store, and Altered Beast was enough to steal my heart and the hard-earned £350 or £380, I believe it was, which was a huge amount of money at the time for a teenager from a multitude of work options. Now, although I never owned one at the time, I always had and have had a soft spot for this minuscule yet muscular machine that embodies the very notion of punching above your weight. An 8-bit console in an ocean of 8-bit computers not only stood out, but it broke new ground that others feared and then later walked. A true paradigm point in the video game landscape that really does not get the credit it deserves. Long live the PC Engine. Now, we have much more to discuss on the mighty white box in part 2, where I pit it against all others that were in the ring and stepped into it post-release. You may be very surprised with some of the results and the breadth of titles I dip into here, so until then, you can watch much more on my channel of retro or even modern titles, or just rewind this one and remind yourself how awesome the PC Engine and 80s were. See you on the next one.